Well, thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. And before we really get started with some of the informational pieces, I've got a slideshow that I think will set the context for us.
Sometimes I'm in pain and I try to explain how I feel. I know that you love me. You want to help me to heal. When my heart is aching, my love like I'm breaking in two. So you try to fix me, but that's not what I need from you. I need a witness, just need you to listen while I open up my heart. I need to tell you what I'm feeling. It's my soul that I'm revealing. So I don't need a lecture or a plan. I need a witness. Please don't run away when I'm trying to say what's inside. I need you to hear me loudly and clearly. Don't hide. When I'm filled with worry, I don't need a jury of my peers. I just need a shoulder, someone to hold me and hear. I need a witness, just need you to listen while I open up my heart. I need to tell you what I'm feeling. It's my soul that I'm revealing. So I don't need a lecture or a plan. I need a witness. I need a witness. I need a witness. Oh, I need a
So as Jessica said, I've personally taken care of more than 10,000 dying veterans. many of whom were traumatized. And it is so ironic that from people who had been trained for war came lessons that I witnessed about how to attain peace. So now that I've kind of set the context for what caregivers are enduring on a day-to-day basis through COVID, we can authentically talk about how to live through a pandemic, how to caregive during a pandemic. So for those of you who work in hospice, do you witness loss, hardship, or death on a regular basis? Raise your hand if you do. Yeah. Do you experience ongoing, unrelenting demands on your time that leaves you drained sometimes and unfulfilled? Raise your hand. And then think about adding the pandemic on top of that. Talk about loss, hardship, and unrelenting demands. These stressors are sources of secondary traumatic stress disorder. How many have ever heard of secondary traumatic stress disorder? Raise your hand if you've heard of that. If you haven't heard of it, it is what used to be called compassion fatigue, what used to be called burnout. If you look in the literature, it's now called it's more about secondary traumatic stress disorder. And your body reacts to these stressors, whether you want it to or not, that are all around. And the key is being able to develop awareness about how your body is reacting. So I first of all want to just give you the very basic essential about post-traumatic stress disorder, because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, talks about the criteria for making a diagnosis of PTSD. We've all heard of PTSD, right? The first criteria for making a diagnosis of PTSD, and there's about 5 different ones, but the first one is experiencing actual or threatened death or serious injury or sexual violence in one of the following ways. Now look at what these 3 following ways are. Direct experience, in other words, it happened to you. Now how about this one? In-person witnessing of others being traumatized. If you've been with dying people, and it can be a very stressful event, you are witnessing it. And then look at the third one, learning about a loved one's traumatic event. So secondary traumatic stress disorder is much of what these second 2 are. And especially if you have repeated exposure. So if you're a hospice worker, you work in the ER, you work in the ICU, you know, if you're a first responder, this should be very, very relevant. It impacts you. No one is immune. If you're thinking, oh, my brain doesn't work the way everybody else's does, I'm different, I'm immune. I'd like for you to rethink that, because I'm going to show you some research that's going to show you how it, in fact, does impact your body. All right. So I want to read to you a poem. It's out of the book, Visions of War, Dreams of Peace. It's written by women who served in the Vietnam War. They used poetry and the arts to help recover from the PTSD that they experienced after they came home from the war. And I want to just read you one poem and see if you can relate to it. Listen to this. Hello, David. My name is Dusty. I'm your night nurse. I'll stay with you. I'll hang more blood and give you something for your pain. I'll stay with you, and I will touch your face. Yes, of course I'll write your mother and tell her you were brave. I'll write your mother and tell her how much you loved her. I'll write your mother and tell her to give your bratty kid sister a big kiss and a hug. I'll stay with you, and I will hold your hand. I'll stay with you and watch your life flow through my fingers into my soul. I'll stay with you until you stay with me. Goodbye, David. My name is Dusty. I am the last person you will see. I am the last person you will touch. I am the last person who will love you. So long, David. My name is Dusty. David, who will give me something for my pain? So I chose this particular poem for two reasons. Those last few lines. I am the last person you will touch. I am the last person who will love you. How many in here, if you work for hospice or in geriatrics, are the last person that someone is touching, is holding, is loving? And then, you know, I always think in terms of what an awesome responsibility it is to hold that in our hands, to have that responsibility. And then that last line, who will give me something for my pain? You know, if you work in hospice, funeral home, ER, nursing home, if you do trauma counseling, bereavement counseling, those types of things, you are surrounded by stress, death, pain, grieving families, families in shock, angry families, and that impacts you. And that causes the release of stress chemicals. And stress chemicals put you on alert. They take you out of being grounded in your body. And often they cause you to numb out and disconnect from yourself. And that's what we're going to talk about. So the question becomes, what do you do with your pain? Do you know what you do with your pain? Where does the pain go when you shut it down? I want you to just think about that for a moment. It's an important question for you to be able to answer. Or is your reality that you take care of one sick patient or one grieving family or one traumatized client and then go right into the next and the next and the next? Because I contend that the distress is not so much about the loss, the hurt, and the grief that you're exposed to. It's that there's no time, no space, and no method to release the loss, grief, and hurt. Am I right on that? So let me share a research study with you. In one research study, 78% of hospice nurses reported signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or secondary traumatic stress disorder. So you can see on your screen some of the most common symptoms. So this is no small matter that we're talking about today. You can see that secondary traumatic stress is an occupational health hazard. And if we have the courage to be honest with ourselves, then we have to realize that organizations have a duty to assess, respond, and prevent secondary traumatic stress. And to fail to do so, I believe, is unethical. And in fact, I love this. You know, when you read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, she talks about how every hospital unit should have attached to it a scream room for staff. I just thought that was great. And essentially what she recommended that was to prevent secondary traumatic stress with staff. Staff need a place to release the stress, to release the trauma that they witness. So if you look up the definition in the literature about what secondary traumatic stress is, it's this: caring for others with compassion and empathy, experiencing the stressful event through the storyteller's eyes. And this causes the caregiver's body to respond as if it's happening to them. You know, so for example, if I gave you, if I asked you to close your eyes and pretend like you were peeling a lemon, and then I asked you to smell it, to feel it, to taste it, how would your body respond if we did this kind of in-depth? You'd start salivating and puckering. Why? Because your body doesn't know the difference between an actual event and an imagined one. It's going to respond no matter what, right? So that's important for us to know. So if you think about the stress of all the competing interests that are pulling at you in different directions, you know, you have demands from your your employer, from insurance companies, from governmental regulations, and the pandemic has magnified all of these demands. And if you really think about broadly, our current healthcare system is a fractured system. And it often leaves the caregiver's soul bankrupt, unable to deliver the care that the patient needs and the caregiver wants to give. And that is the definition of secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the research that Dale Larson out in California has done for many, many, many years and reported on in the hospice literature. But at any rate, he talks about the definition of his research in looking at staff. And he says this is what it means to have secondary traumatic stress. For a worker to become demoralized from wanting to do good work, but not able to. And what happens then? That leads to frustration and decreased caring. So think about the pandemic, the impact on healthcare workers. The heartbreak of not being able to care for patients in the ways that the patient needs has caused many caregivers, including some in this room, no doubt, to feel alone, anxious, and frustrated, and helpless. So I have heard heartbreaking stories from hospice professionals who've had to watch as patients had to, could not have families visit. Our hospital workers where the patients had to have surgery alone or had to go through rehab alone, have to die alone. And this ongoing heartbreak has broken many caregivers' hearts as they've had to sit back and watch helplessly. And that often leaves unmourned loss and hurt. And that's what deadens the spirit of healthcare professionals. Now, everybody wants to be who here wants to be the perfect healthcare provider, right? Yes, of course. Do you know what the perfect healthcare provider looks like? See if you can relate to this. How about this? Isn't this precious? Don't you love the shoes, the be everywhere, all at once skates that have to be a hand holder, document, document, document. You have to be fiscally responsible, be the resource manager, have to answer that ringing phone. Yeah, I love this one, toothpicks for sleepy eyes. Have to have a big heart, be always optimistic, take care of the government regulations, dispense medications, insurance compliance, keep the environment no matter what's going on, keep it on an even keel, answer to your boss again, and document, document, document. Is this anybody's life here? Or is it only mine? Is this stress? This is stress. The literature used to call it burnout, used to call it compassion fatigue, but this is what you're going to see the term that's used more recently as secondary traumatic stress. And why? Because a lot of the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress are the same as post-traumatic stress. So see if you can identify with how one physician, this is one of the physicians that works with us at Opus Peace. Here's how she described her secondary traumatic stress. This is what she said. I knew I had moved into burnout when I could no longer respond to the nurses calling for help with their patients. My compassion was gone. That's when I made a decision to seek a different job. I also had to summon the courage to rehome scattered pieces of myself I had left behind. What do you think about that? This physician was not only experiencing symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, but because the distress caused her to become separated from her own sense of self, she also experienced a soul injury. We define at Opus Peace that a soul injury is when you become separated from your own sense of self, that there becomes a barrier from keeping you from being who you are meant to be. Now, instead of summoning the courage to reunite with scattered pieces of self, the way this physician courageously did, and she is back working as a physician, we often just do what? We just buckle down and try to work harder and faster and more furiously. And that may work for a little while, but it doesn't work over time, because we are human beings, and human beings have limitations. But if you're like me, you sometimes forget that and you think you can be all things to all people at all times. Do you ever find yourself saying, I don't take lunch, I just snack on my break, or I scarf it down before I have to go into a presentation, right? Or I stay over until everything gets done, which is almost every day. And what I would say is this: these are not things to be proud of. Yet sometimes we get so proud that we're critical of others who don't skip their breaks, who do go home on time. Can you relate to what I'm saying? Yes, sir. So what I would also add is that martyrs and enablers are not heroes. It takes honesty, courage, and humility to let yourself be vulnerable, to be human with needs of your own, and to ask for help. So let's talk about ways that you can empower your brain by changing how it reacts to stress. And the secret lies in recognizing the sensations in your body. We talk about stress all the time, but we act like it's only up here in our head. But what I'm going to show you is that the research shows that it's in our body. The secret lies in recognizing the sensations in your body, because when you are helpless to either fight or flight the distress, then the stress chemicals are left circulating in the body, where they get stored into body memory. That makes sense?
She wanders through the valleys and the hills on this dark, dark winter's night. The leaves left the trees and the townspeople cast her to the waning light. Searching for a home, searching for a place to rest her head. There is something inside of her wanting release on this dark, dark winter's night. And the story in the heavens reminds her of light divine, where there is no fear, no separation, no suffering, only one. And the angels sing, glory, come lay your head, glory, and you shall be fed, as you bring forth light to the world this dark night. I wandered through the streets of the desert on this dark, dark winter's night, treading with a heavy heart, broken by the war raging around me. Red and blue sirens are singing in the key of tragedy. Yet the peace that passes all understanding is standing here, holding me. The story in the heavens reminds me of light divine, where there is no hunger, no hate, no greed, only one. And the angels sing, glory, light to the world on this dark night. We wander through the valleys and the hills on this dark, dark winter's night. I reach for your hand and walk beside you. My lantern grows bright. The star in the heavens beckons us to light divine, where there is no fear, no separation, no suffering. To the world on this dark night.
I apologize a little bit, that timing was off because of computer incompatibility there. But I hope that you have an appreciation for the hard work, the stress that's on you every single day. What I want to give you in this next section is how it impacts your brain, and therefore how it impacts your body. And the information that I'm going to give you is from the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It forms the basis for what we're going to talk about because it is research-based, it is comprehensive, and it includes holistic interventions. It's written by Dr. Bessel, who is a physician psychiatrist who has devoted his career to responding to people who have been traumatized. He has the Center for Trauma in Boston, and he's considered by many to be the leading expert on PTSD. So the idea that the body keeps the score is not new, is it? Think about lie detector tests. The whole basis for lie detectors is that you can say one thing, but if it's not true, the lie will register in your body. Think about verbal and nonverbal communication. It is well known that if verbal messages don't match nonverbal messages, it's the body language that's more likely telling the truth. Now, prior to the 1990s, the brain was not really studied the way other organs were, but new tools have opened the door to understand the brain. So evidence-based practice is now possible in ways unlike ever before. And the good news is the current brain research is changing how we treat stress. Imaging technology now gives us the means to track how acute and chronic stress changes the brain. Gene markers have shown us how some genes are turned off by trauma and other genes are turned on by trauma. We now know that nerve pathways are changed, causing some parts of the brain to go offline and become non-functional. And we now know how to coax the stressed out brain into different patterns. And this is known as neuroplasticity. In other words, the brain can be changed. We now know how to coax the stressed out brain into these new patterns so that the brain in its fear-based fight, flight, freeze brain stressed out mode doesn't have to stay in that on position secreting adrenaline and cortisol all the time. And these research findings are very popular, aren't they? How many of you seen this type of thing about the brain research on PBS or Dr. Oz or Dr. Phil? We're seeing it everywhere nowadays, right? So now you may think that you only have one brain, but you actually have three. We have a primitive survival brain, which acts instinctively. So the primitive brain is active at birth. So think about when a baby is born. This brain is very active, regulating peeing and pooping and hunger and breathing and heart rate, all those kinds of things. The next part of the brain, the mid part of the brain, develops, and this is the emotional brain, or the limbic system. And this is what's important. This is what registers trauma. This part of the brain maps the world as good, bad, neutral, and it has a bias toward the bad. This is important. It has a bias toward the negative. So it's kind of like the primitive brain. It's geared towards survival. Now, the last part of the brain to develop is the rational brain. It's this frontal cortex that allows us to bond to and relate to others. It is the logical part of the brain that allows us to analyze and problem solve. Now, here's the thing. Full maturation of the brain doesn't occur until your mid-20s. Anybody have teenagers? Do they ever make bad decisions? There's a reason why. Their frontal cortex hasn't yet developed for that logical, they're just in the moment. They can't kind of see around the corner, so to speak. So let's talk about how these three different parts of your brain impact your life. So Bessel van der Kolk says that fear is the basis for our survival. If a cheetah is chasing you, it's important that you recognize that danger and escape are what happens. You get eaten alive, right? So adrenaline helps you escape. Now there's also a resting, at ease, relaxation nervous system that's mediated by a chemical called acetylcholine. And what acetylcholine does is say, hey, there's no cheetahs around, just relax and chill out. You don't need to have all that adrenaline going. Now there are nerves, when we have nerves, they have gaps in between where one nerve stops and another one starts. And there's chemicals in between that carry the messages from one nerve to the next. Now let me tell you this. When both adrenaline and acetylcholine are both present in this gap between the nerves, which chemical do you think takes precedence? The adrenaline. You can have a huge amount of acetylcholine and only a tiny amount of adrenaline, and in an instant, adrenaline takes over, right? There's that adrenaline rush. Now, why is this? Because van der Kolk says your brain is hardwired toward survival. That means it's going to prefer fear-based to keep you safe. Now, van der Kolk says that when faced with good and bad stimuli, that brain is actually going to prefer the bad stimuli so that we can avoid those. Afterward, when their frontal cortex comes back online, they'll go, what was I thinking? Why did I do this? Why did I do that? Why didn't I escape over here? Why didn't I? Well, the reason why is because that frontal cortex goes offline when that midbrain is firing. So you may not be chased by cheetahs very often. The cheetah in your life might be an angry parent, or a boss, or a spouse, or a car wreck, or a chronic illness. Your body will respond the same, whether it's a cheetah, or an angry person, or an accident, or an illness. Anytime you feel threatened, adrenaline will kick in to alert you to possible danger. And it does that from a very specific part of the brain. And here's the part of the brain that it does it from. It's called the amygdala. So within this middle part of the brain is a special part of the brain whose job is to keep you safe, to keep you from getting eaten, to keep you out of danger. And it registers threats and makes sure that they get imprinted so that even an anticipated threat won't harm you in the future. So that part of the brain is called the amygdala. If you study anything about stress, anything about trauma, trauma-informed care, you're going to hear this word amygdala. And that's because it's the center for fight, flight, freeze response for mediating that. Now, people get triggered a lot of times, and in the literature, this is called the amygdala hijack. So it's as if the amygdala has hijacked the brain and says, stop what you're doing and do what I want you to do. And when this happens, again, the frontal cortex goes offline. It doesn't have the ability to turn that amygdala off. That adrenaline's already in the system. And if the amygdala stays in that on position most of the time, guess what emerges? PTSD. That's how you get PTSD. So the amygdala is more powerful than willpower. So you can say, oh, just calm down, get over it. But it's too late because that adrenaline, that cortisol has already circulated in your body. However, we do now know that there are ways to develop a better relationship with our amygdala so that it loses its power to hijack us, to react. And Bessel van der Kolk says that the research is proving this, that the best way to do this is by learning to tone down the amygdala by helping it to know that the body is safe. And yet we don't get too much education on how to keep our body safe, right? So let's see what van der Kolk says. He says that unmourned loss and hurt gets stored in our bodies, our minds, and our soul. There's even a famous saying that goes like this: those who grieve well, what? Heal well. I've also heard it said, those who grieve well, live well. Either way. And the reason why is that grieving helps us let go of the past and what was, and open up to what is. Open up to the present moment. Grieving is truly the secret for living in the present moment. The problem is, mainly we want to minimize emotional pain. We want to pretend it's not there. We want to medicate it. We want to numb it. And if we're a caregiver, we want to fix it. We want to rescue others. We want to make hurts magically disappear. But when you box up your pain, your vitality, your personhood gets boxed up as well, doesn't it? And not only that, you miss that secret lesson for learning how to release the loss. So make no mistake about it. It takes honesty, courage, and humility to open our hearts to emotional pain, whether it be our own or others. But fear of emotional pain does far more damage than learning how to allow ourselves to feel the pain without setting that amygdala off. So as much as you try to avoid grief, there are times when it might burst on the scene anyway. And this is called a STUG reaction. And STUG is an acronym for sudden temporary upsurges of grief. So these are bursts of grief that can feel overwhelming because they often sneak up on you when you least expect it. Sounds, songs, smells are particularly effective in precipitating STUGs. Just to give you a personal example, I remember one time I was doing a project on our hospice unit and I needed a paintbrush. And so I said, well, I'll just go down to the paint shop and borrow a paintbrush. And so I run down to the paint shop, I knock on the door, and the guy opens the door. And when he opened the door, the smell of varnish wafted out into the hallway. And I immediately burst into tears. I mean, this poor guy, he opens the door and I'm sitting there, my dad had died about a year before, and my dad had been a varnish chemist. And so when I smelled that varnish, it sent me back to being a child. And luckily, I knew when I was triggered by this memory, instead of shutting down and to open up to it. And I recovered a wonderful memory that I used, when my dad would come home from work, I used to love to crawl up into his lap and smell his shirt. I actually thought he wore varnish as a perfume. I really did. But I loved having that memory. See, learning how to open up to something instead of closing down and being afraid of the emotional pain. So let me give you, I want us to learn, hold on just a minute. This is a newspaper article in the Tampa Bay Times, which is where I'm from. And it chronicled how a PTSD counselor helped veterans with PTSD. And the reporter interviewed both the counselor and the traumatized veteran, and his name was Lee Prestonary in the article. And here, I want to just show you what the newspaper article said. Here's what it said. In his mind, Lee Prestonary kept circling the crash site. His friends were in the wreckage below, and he couldn't help. The memory brought him to tears. Seated across from him is a trauma expert watching his body language. And she encouraged a drill, coaching him to use the tools she had trained him in. And this was the tool: to unclench while remembering the pain. And this allowed him to accept what he knew consciously, which was that there was nothing he could have done to change what had happened. He truly was helpless. So let's learn how to unclench right now. Now, the purpose of unclenching is to create an interior space whereby emotional pain and peace can sit side by side together without fear. So you want to practice unclenching whenever you might feel uptight, anxious, upset, helpless, even though you're not in harm's way per se. Now, to do this means that you have to become better acquainted with the part of yourself that's holding your stress, your pain, and your hurt. And that means temporarily suspending numbing mechanisms that you may be using that disconnect you from this part of yourself. Even if it's only for a few moments, getting a glimpse of the part of you that is strong and capable of holding your emotional pain will help you reconnect with that part of yourself. So it's the idea is, rather than letting the amygdala and that fear-based brain control you, it means learning how to make some different connections in those synapses between the nerves. And that's what will help you re-own pieces of yourself that you may have lost or forgotten. It'll help you learn how to rehome these pieces by creating internal safety. That's what Bessel van der Kolk talks about all the time, creating safety within your own body. And the result then is that you become revitalized with the energy of your deepest self. So again, just doing this for a few moments with practice will actually change your nervous system. So here's what I want us to do. I want you to let yourself think about something that may be a bit disappointing, a bit hurtful. I want you to pick something in your mind. Not a big stressor, just something little. We're only going to do this for about 4 minutes. Pick a loss that stings but doesn't overwhelm. Maybe it's just a disappointment of taking time away from your busy schedule today to come here. That's a loss, isn't it? You lost some time from how you anticipated your day was going to. That's still a little bit of a loss. Or maybe it's, you know, your boss told you needed a certain report done today, interrupting your schedule. These may be small stressors, but that loss of expectation, the loss of time, is still a loss to be mourned. Otherwise, what happens? You stay stuck in the idea of wishing things could be something different instead of being able to adjust to the present moment. So everybody have one little loss that you're going to ask you to remember it in about 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you to recall the loss, but pick it out right now, just something small. All right? So now, if you can, I want everybody just to kind of put both feet on the ground if you can. And if you can, lower your eyes or close them completely so that you can turn away from the outside world and focus just a little bit on your interior world. And take a few deep breaths and let yourself relax just a little bit more than you are right now. Just unfurl your brow, unclench your jaw. Imagine your neck and shoulders sort of melting. Notice your heart beating quietly. And just scan your body down to your feet. Notice how there might be a space in your feet that feels open and free, yet feels grounded and secure. Again, take a few more deep breaths. Inhaling deeply and exhaling. And as you exhale, take a big deep breath in. And as you exhale, let it go almost like a sigh of relief. Just do that a few times at your own pace. And now let your body breathe however it wants to. And now place one or both of your hands firmly over your heart. Whichever you prefer, one hand or both, whatever feels most comfortable to you. And tenderly anchor your heart with your support and your strength. Pay attention to how your heart may be closed or numbed with fear of emotional pain. And just for a few moments, let yourself think about something that may be a bit stressful. Whatever you picked a moment ago, again, not a big hurt, maybe a disappointment, a loss that stings but doesn't overwhelm. And just for this moment, let yourself feel that loss. The pain you are feeling is real. It is part of your experience. The pain is yours, but it is not you. It is not who you are. You can feel the pain that you have, but it doesn't define who you are. For just this moment, you can suspend your fear of pain and hurt by just letting yourself be curious about how it is affecting you. And be aware of this part of you that has been strong enough to hold the pain for you. And breathe deeply this part of yourself. Know that this too is a part of who you are. And as you prepare to slowly open your eyes, resolve to bring this part of you with you. Know that this is the place inside you that's able to let pain and peace sit side by side without fear. So just take a few deep breaths as you slowly open your eyes, bringing this sense of yourself with you as we proceed through this time together. Learning to unclench. It's not a magic bullet, as much as we would all like to have a magic bullet that immediately changes our reaction to stress and turns that amygdala off when there's no real threat. The brain doesn't work like that. But just like with all habits, some repeated practice using this anchoring heart technique will help to keep you grounded. And you may be surprised at how your brain will start responding because you have to retrain it. And you might also be surprised that it doesn't take all that long to do it. Now, as Bessel Kolk says, the body holds memories that the conscious memory cannot recall. Now, we normally think of managing stress as something we do with our mind, but van der Kolk says, no, it's focusing on the part of the brain that registers body sensations. That's the key. The part of the brain that he is referring to is this next part of the brain that I want to show you. There is a central corridor of the brain with all these structures, and you don't need to know all these structures, but the point that van der Kolk says is this is the part of self that gives you a sense of self. This is the part of the brain that registers sensations in your body. And there's a couple very interesting things that his research shows. Okay, where are you? This isn't always wanting to. If you have abused or neglected children and you do brain scans, guess what? This part of the brain doesn't light up. They don't have a sense of self. This part of their brain doesn't register bodily sensations that can help them feel safe. See, this is what the research is showing us. The other thing I find is, that he reports is when they do brain scans of people who meditate every day, guess what happens? This part of the brain, the central structures, light up. You see what we're learning about this? So he says that healing stress and trauma requires activating this part of the brain. And at Opus Peace, we call this the me brain, right? Gives me my sense of me, of who I am. And abused children, neglected children have a hard time with that, having a sense of self. There's no internal safety. Now, the other thing that van der Kolk says is that PTSD is largely caused by immobilization. This is what he means. He says, when you are being traumatized and you are helpless to either fight or escape, fight the stressor, you are much more likely to get PTSD. So that's why helplessness is such a key to preventing the stress reaction. Because he says what happens is those stress chemicals, when they have no place to go because you're not actively releasing them or moving them, end up getting stored in the body and body memory. And therein, that's the problem. So the worst thing you can do with when you're under stress is to just sit and do nothing. He talks about the importance of being able to move. Don't just sit and do nothing. So when you're overcome, for example, with memories of a trauma or a betrayal, you know, that's not the time. When you're overcome with it, that's not the time to sit still and try to meditate. And sometimes the anchoring heart technique's not going to work during that time when it's overwhelming. First, you have to move. You have to get those chemicals moving. So what I think is when people say, oh, you just relax and just sit, and when you're overwhelmed, just sit and meditate. Well, yeah, I wish I could do that. But I think it's like this. It would be kind of like getting off of a merry-go-round that made you dizzy. And someone said, stop walking and just stand still. Right? Well, first of all, it's nearly impossible to stand still when you're really dizzy. And second of all, if you did try to stand still, you'd probably fall over. What you need is grounding. You need a solid hand and you need to stagger kind of a bit before you get your bearings back. So when you're truly overwhelmed with stress, what you want to do is not sit, but you want to walk, you want to pace, you want to ride a bike. You know, when people are triggered from past trauma, they tend to dissociate. They tend to disappear from their bodies. That me brain shuts down. So moving is what helps them regain their senses. So it's almost like you have to look at stress as zones. And when you're in the red zone, meditation's not going to help at that moment. Anchoring the heart may not help at that moment. It's moving is what helps at that moment. The anchoring heart, why the anchoring heart is so important is because it prevents going into the red zone. So catch it while it's in the yellow zone before it goes into the red zone, and then you can prevent that. So, all right, I don't want to, I'm going to skip the next slide. I'm going to skip that slide so that, because I don't want to go over. When we don't know how to consciously release the stress, if we are afraid of emotional pain, what ends up happening? We use numbing agents. Can anybody here relate to some of these numbing agents? What are your favorite numbing agents? Do you know what your favorite numbing agents are? Do you know what your go-to stress reducers are? It's important that you know. It's really important that you know, because those numbing agents will sequester your vitality as well. That's when we kind of slowly start losing ourselves and start kind of feeling dead inside. And then what do? Instead of recognizing that, what will we do? We'll point fingers, we'll get anxious, everything's anxious. Is there a lot of anxiety right now going on during the pandemic? Are we at risk for blaming each other, blaming our bosses, you know, blaming our spouses and doing all this stuff? And what is it really? It's the anxiety, and that's a way to keep the pain and the losses that we've all experienced, instead of feeling them and being honest about the helplessness that we have during this pandemic that we cannot control. It's a lot easier to get angry at someone and blame them, right? Then we don't feel so helpless. So Kolk says he did a research study on yoga with people who had received treatment for their PTSD, and they had with medications, and it had failed. He took that group of people, did 10 weeks of yoga with them, and he said the results of their PTSD the symptoms were so much less. He said that if it would have been a pill, it would have been reported in the front of the New York Times. But because it was yoga, it got very little report in the public media. So, I'm gonna go back. I'm sorry, some of this isn't. My screen and that screen don't always match, so that's why I'm a little discombobulated. Effective soul work includes paying attention to your body, and there are lots of ways to do that. If you asked your soul what you should do to manage your stress, to integrate your trauma, to strengthen your me brain so that you have a strong sense of self, you know what your soul would shout to you? Things like that. This. Speak the distress in your soul. Sing your distress. Cry your distress. Draw your distress. Dance your distress. Exercise your distress. Write your distress a letter. Have your distress write you a letter. Externalize the helplessness that we all feel during this pandemic. Helplessness should be something that we're talking about and dialoguing with, so that it doesn't have to come out in unconscious ways like anxiety and anger and blame. Interesting, Kolk talks about taking recess and chorus and play out of school. He says, don't ever do that. He said, we should never cut that out from curriculums, because these activities are what helps children develop the me brain. He said, especially abused and neglected children need play and recess and acting, those types of things. And he also says that this part of the brain that helps the kids feel safe helps adults feel good too. So it's not too late to change the brain. And he says that that's the way to do it. So I'm going to close by just talking about, in 2 minutes, how to rewire, how he would put it, rewiring old hardware or brain and installing new software. So I've given you a few clues today, and this is just an overview, but learn how to allow peace and distress to sit side to side together without fear. I gave you a very simple tool. You are going to be amazed at how effective it will be in changing your brain and those nerve synapses. If you'll just practice it on little things, that'll start getting those pathways. Any habit is just a nerve pathway. And the more you use it, the easier it will be. Consider your numbing agents and how that might be impacting your body, your mind, and your soul. Use movement to dissipate stress when it's overwhelming in that red zone. Consider forgiving your helplessness and loss of control with the parts of your life you cannot change. We've got a lot of helplessness going on right now in this world, do we not? Forgive your body for getting tired and not being able to condense 48 hours of work into 12 hours. How many of you are personal caregivers? Raise your hand if you're a personal caregiver of someone else. Yeah. We have to forgive reality, grounded in truth rather than the illusion of how things should be. Right? And we have a lot of, oh, this is how it should be, whether it be politics, whether it be in the workplaces, whatever. We have to forgive ourselves for thinking that you can or should be able to do it all by yourself. Isn't that how we feel competent? I heard someone say just this morning how he felt like a failure because he couldn't do more to help others during this pandemic. Wow. Can't we all agree with that and identify with that? But how often do we have the courage, the vulnerability to be able to actually say it? Give yourself permission to have needs, validate your hardships, accept that you have limitations, ask for help. Don't get squeezed out of your own life. And do I have time for the last slideshow? Or should I? Okay, I'm going to that's where I'm going to end.